The security guard's meaty hand landed on Coltrane Weatherby's shoulder with the force of finality. "You need to leave, sir. This is a private auction for serious buyers only." Coltrane's weathered face remained impassive as he adjusted his threadbare flannel shirt, the fabric so worn it barely held together at the seams. His work boots, held together with duct tape and prayers, squeaked against the polished concrete floor of the Meridian County Horse Auction House. Around him, men in pressed suits and polished leather shoes turned to stare, their expressions ranging from amused to disgusted. "I have my registration card," Coltrane said quietly, reaching into his back pocket with deliberate slowness. The motion revealed more holes in his clothing, a testament to decades of hard labor on his struggling farm. The guard barely glanced at the crumpled paper. "Look, buddy, this isn't some county fair. These horses go for tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands. Maybe try the livestock auction down the road." Snickers rippled through the crowd of well-dressed bidders. Coltrane recognized some faces: real estate moguls, tech entrepreneurs who'd bought ranches as weekend hobbies, and old money families whose wealth stretched back generations. They looked at him like he was something unpleasant they'd stepped. "Honestly, how did security even let him in?" whispered Cordelia Vanderberg, her diamond earrings catching the auction house lights. She wrinkled her nose as if Coltrane's presence had somehow contaminated the air around her designer handbag. Beauregard Huntington III adjusted his silk tie and chuckled to his companion. "Probably looking for scraps behind the cafeteria. These types always are." Coltrane's calloused hands remained steady at his sides, though something flickered behind his steel-gray eyes. He'd heard worse things said about him over the years, had endured countless humiliations, as his small farm barely survived, while corporate agriculture swallowed up his neighbors' land one by one. The auctioneer, a portly man named Vernon Pike, approached with obvious irritation. "What's the holdup here? We have serious business to conduct." "Just removing some debris," the security guard replied, his grip tightening on Coltrane's arm, but Coltrane didn't move. Instead, he slowly pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook from his shirt pocket. The cover was cracked and stained, held together with a rubber band. As he flipped through pages covered in careful handwriting, the crowd's laughter grew louder. "He taking notes on how to dress properly?" someone called out. "Maybe he's writing his grocery list." Coltrane found the page he was looking for and studied it intently. His grandfather's handwriting stared back at him, recording bloodlines and breeding records that went back 4 generations. This wasn't just about buying a horse. This was about completing a promise he'd made to a dying old man. The security guard tugged harder. "Come on, let's go." "I'm staying," Coltrane said simply, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made several nearby bidders pause their mockery. The guard's face reddened. "Sir, I'm not asking anymore. You're disrupting a legitimate business function." As Coltrane was forcibly escorted toward the exit, he caught sight of the magnificent Arabian stallion being led into the show ring. Midnight coat gleaming under the lights, the horse moved with the fluid grace of liquid shadow. Even from across the auction floor, Coltrane could see the intelligence burning in those dark eyes. This was the one. This was exactly what his grandfather had described. The heavy doors slammed shut behind him, but Coltrane Weatherby wasn't done yet. 20 minutes later, the auction house doors swung open again with a resonating bang that cut through the excited chatter surrounding Lot 47, the magnificent Arabian stallion that had just entered the ring. Every head turned toward the entrance, expecting perhaps a late-arriving VIP bidder. Instead, they saw Coltrane Weatherby walking back in. Gone were the tattered flannel shirt and duct-taped boots. In their place, he wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that whispered of expensive Italian craftsmanship. His silver hair, previously hidden under a beaten baseball cap, was now neatly combed and gleaming. The transformation was so complete that several bidders actually rubbed their eyes, certain they were hallucinating. The security guard who had ejected him 20 minutes earlier stood frozen, his mouth agape. But you were just..." Coltrane walked past him without a word, his polished Oxford shoes clicking authoritatively against the floor. In his manicured hand, he carried a slim leather portfolio that replaced the crumpled notebook. Everything about his bearing had changed. Gone was the hunched posture of a man beaten down by circumstances, replaced by the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. Vernon Pike, the auctioneer, stuttered mid-sentence as Coltrane took a seat in the front row, directly across from where Cordelia Vanderberg sat, with her mouth hanging open. The Arabian stallion seemed to sense the shift in energy, pawing the ground and tossing his magnificent head, as if acknowledging the presence of someone who truly understood horses. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pike continued, trying to regain his composure, "we have Midnight's Thunder, a purebred Arabian stallion with bloodlines tracing back to the legendary horses of the Arabian Peninsula. Bidding starts at $50,000. Beauregard Huntington III raised his paddle immediately. $50,000. $60,000, called out Marcus Ashworth, a software billionaire who collected rare horses like vintage wines. The bidding climbed steadily. 70, 80, 90,000. Coltrane sat motionless, his eyes never leaving the stallion. The horse, as if sensing this attention, kept turning its gaze toward him, creating an almost mystical connection that several observers noticed. 100,000, announced Helena. Fairfax, heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune. 125, countered Huntington, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. At 150,000, the bidding slowed. Only 3 serious contenders remained: Huntington, Ashworth, and a mysterious phone bidder represented by Pike's assistant. The auction house had grown quiet except for the rhythmic breathing of the stallion and the scratch of Pike's pen as he tracked the bids. 175,000, Ashworth called, his voice strained. Huntington hesitated, then shook his head. He was out. Do I hear 180? Pike's voice echoed through the suddenly tense air. The phone bidder went to 185. Ashworth countered with 190. The mysterious phone bidder pushed it to $200,000. Ashworth slumped back in his chair, defeated. Too rich for my blood. Pike scanned the room one final time. Going once at 200,000, going twice. That's when Coltrane Weatherby raised his paddle for the first time. $250,000. The auction house erupted. In shocked murmurs, Pike's gavel froze midway to the podium. Even the stallion seemed to pause as if understanding that something momentous had just occurred. Cordelia Vanderberg leaned forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. Who is that man? But it was Helena Fairfax who whispered the answer that would soon spread through the wealthy circles of the county like wildfire. I think we just discovered that sometimes you really can't judge a book by its cover. The phone bidder's representative whispered urgently into her device, then looked up at Vernon Pike with wide eyes. My client withdraws from the bidding. A stunned silence fell over the auction house. $250,000, more than most people earned in 5 years, had just been casually offered by a man they'd tried to throw out as a vagrant less than an hour ago. Pike's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. Do I have any other bids? Going once at 250,000? Beauregard Huntington III found his voice. Now wait just a minute. I demand to see proof of funds. Anyone can throw out numbers. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Marcus Ashworth nodded vigorously. Exactly, this is highly irregular. For all we know, this is some kind of elaborate prank. Coltrane reached into his leather portfolio and withdrew a single document. He handed it to Pike without a word. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up as he examined the paper, a bank certification letter bearing the seal of First National Trust, one of the most exclusive private banking institutions in the state. The bid is verified, Pike announced, his voice barely above a whisper. The crowd exploded into conversation. How could someone who looked like a homeless vagrant 30 minutes ago now be throwing around $250,000 like pocket change? The whispers grew more intense as people began pulling out their smartphones, frantically searching for any information about Coltrane Weatherby. Helena Fairfax was the first to find something. Her face went pale as she read from her phone screen. Oh my God, she breathed. Weatherby Agricultural Holdings. That's one of the largest private agricultural companies in the Midwest. Cordelia Vanderberg snatched the phone from her friend's hands, her perfectly manicured fingers scrolling rapidly through the search results. Estimated net worth, $800 million? She looked up at Coltrane with new eyes, her previous disdain replaced by something approaching awe. But it was young Donovan Ricketts, a tech entrepreneur who'd made his fortune in agricultural software, who found the most interesting information. "Look at this," he called out, causing everyone to turn toward him. Weatherby Agricultural Holdings has been quietly acquiring failing family farms across 7 states, not to demolish them, but to modernize them and lease them back to the original families at sustainable rates. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just another wealthy collector adding to his stable. This was a man who'd spent decades building an empire specifically designed to save the kind of small farms that were disappearing. Across America, Coltrane remained seated calmly as the chaos swirled around him. The Arabian stallion seemed to sense the shift in energy, stepping closer to the edge of the ring, as if trying to get nearer to the man who would soon be his owner. Vernon Pike cleared his throat loudly, trying to regain control of his auction. "Ladies and gentlemen, we still have business to conduct. Going twice at $250,000. "Wait!" called out a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see Jasper Beaumont, the most senior horse breeder present, slowly making his way toward the front. At 83 years old, Beaumont commanded respect throughout the equestrian world. "Mr. Weatherby," Beaumont said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in the business. "I knew your grandfather, Ezekiel Weatherby. Fine man, finest horseman I ever met." Coltrane stood for the first time since placing his bid, showing proper respect to the elder breeder. "Thank you, sir. He spoke of you often." Beaumont nodded slowly, then turned to address the room. "For those of you wondering about credentials, Ezekiel Weatherby bred some of the finest quarter horses this country has ever seen. If his grandson wants this Arabian, there's a damn good reason for it." The validation from such a respected figure, the community sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd, but these were different, respectful, almost reverent. Pike raised his gavel one final time. "Sold for $250,000 to Mr. Coltrane Weatherby." As the gavel fell with its final, decisive thud, Coltrane Weatherby walked toward the show ring where midnight's thunder waited. The stallion, as if recognizing his new owner, approached the barrier with surprising gentleness for such a powerful animal. When Coltrane extended his hand, the horse nuzzled it softly, creating a moment of connection that silenced even the most skeptical observers. "Magnificent," whispered Jasper Beaumont, who had remained near the front of the room. "That horse knows quality when he sees it." The crowd began to disperse, many stopping to introduce themselves to Coltrane with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for discovering hidden treasure. But it was Cordelia Vanderberg who approached first, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Mr. Weatherby, I owe you an apology," she began, her usual haughty demeanor replaced by genuine contrition. "My behavior earlier was inexcusable." Coltrane turned from the horse, his expression neither harsh nor particularly forgiving. "Mrs. Vanderberg, isn't it? I know your late husband's work with the Children's Hospital Foundation. Good man." The simple acknowledgement, free of any vindictiveness, somehow made her shame burn deeper. "Why were you? Earlier you looked like a farmer who'd been working his land since before dawn?" Coltrane's mouth quirked slightly. "Because that's exactly what I was doing. I've got 300 acres of winter wheat that needed checking before I could make it here." Marcus Ashworth, who had been listening nearby, stepped forward with his own sheepish expression. "But surely you could have, with your resources." "Could have what? Paid someone else to do the work I love?" Coltrane shook his head. "Mr. Ashworth, I built my company by understanding that the soil doesn't care about your bank account. Neither do the animals. They respond to knowledge, respect, and genuine care." Helena Fairfax had been researching more on her phone. "Mr. Weatherby, according to this article, You personally visit every farm in your network at least twice a year. You still work the land yourself? Every day I can, Coltrane confirmed. My grandfather taught me that you can't run an agricultural business from a boardroom. You have to understand the rhythm of the seasons, the needs of the animals, the feel of good soil between your fingers. Beauregard Huntington III, who had been conspicuously quiet since the revelation of Coltrane's identity, finally found his voice. So the clothing earlier was exactly what any sensible farmer wears when checking winter wheat at 5 in the morning, Coltrane replied evenly. I keep a change of clothes in my truck for occasions like this, but I wasn't planning to need them until after the auction started. The security guard who had ejected him earlier appeared at Coltrane's elbow, his face red with mortification. Sir, I don't know what to say. I made a terrible mistake. Coltrane studied the man for a moment. What's your name? Braden Kowalski, sir. Well, Braden, you were doing your job as you understood it. The fault wasn't entirely yours. His gaze swept over the crowd of well-dressed bidders. We all make assumptions based on appearances. The difference is what we do when we discover we're wrong. Young Donovan Ricketts, who had been unusually quiet during the exchanges, stepped forward with obvious nervousness. Mr. Weatherby, I've been following your company's work for years. The sustainable farming initiatives, the technology integration, programs. Would you consider meeting with me sometime? I think there might be ways we could collaborate. For the first time since his identity had been revealed, Coltrane smiled genuinely. I'd be happy to, son. Innovation in agriculture isn't about replacing traditional methods. It's about enhancing them. Vernon Pike approached with the ownership papers for Midnight's Thunder. Mr. Weatherby, will you be transporting the horse today? My trailers use, outside, Coltrane replied, accepting the documents. Though I suspect he'll need a few minutes to adjust to the idea of leaving with a man in work clothes. The comment drew chuckles from several nearby observers, but there was something in Coltrane's tone that suggested he was only half joking. 3 hours after the auction ended, Coltrane Weatherby stood in the gravel parking lot beside his horse trailer, a custom-built unit that, while not flashy, was clearly designed by someone who understood animal transport. He'd changed back into his work clothes, much to the continued amazement of several auction attendees who had followed him outside. Midnight's Thunder loaded into the trailer with surprising ease, as if he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment. The stallion's calm acceptance of Coltrane's guidance spoke volumes about the farmer's natural way with horses. Incredible, murmured Dr. Vivian Cross, a veterinarian who specialized in Arabian horses and had been observing the loading process. I've seen that horse reject handlers with 20 years of experience, but he's following you like a devoted dog. Coltrane secured the trailer's safety restraints with practiced efficiency. My grandfather always said that horses can sense intention. They know the difference between someone who wants to control them and someone who wants to partner with them. Jasper Beaumont, who had been standing quietly nearby, stepped forward. Coltrane, I have to ask, why this particular horse? I know, you could have acquired any Arabian in the country through private sale. Coltrane pulled out his worn leather notebook, now returned to his shirt pocket where it belonged. He opened it to a page near the back, where his grandfather's shaky handwriting described a bloodline that went back 5 generations. My grandfather spent 40 years trying to find a horse with these specific bloodlines, Coltrane explained, his voice soft with memory. He died 6 months ago, still searching. This stallion is the last known descendant of the mare my great-great-grandfather lost during the Depression, when he had to sell everything to keep the farm. The revelation hung in the air like morning mist. Several of the auction attendees who had followed him outside exchanged glances, finally understanding that this purchase wasn't about wealth or status. It was about completing a family circle that had been broken nearly a century ago. Helena Fairfax wiped at her eyes. So you've been looking for this horse your whole life? Actually, I've been looking for him for 6 months, Coltrane corrected gently. Before that, I was just learning how to be worthy of him. Cordelia Vanderberg, who had remained nearby with obvious discomfort, finally spoke up. Mr. Weatherby, I need to understand something. Why didn't you say anything when people were treating you so poorly? Coltrane closed the notebook and looked at her with those steady gray eyes. Mrs. Vanderberg, my grandfather, used to say that a man's character isn't defined by how he acts when people know who he is. It's defined by how he acts when they don't. The simple statement hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. Several people shifted uncomfortably, remembering their earlier behavior. Marcus Ashworth cleared his throat. That's quite a philosophy. It served me well, Coltrane replied, then looked around at the faces surrounding him. But I want you all to know, what happened in there today wasn't really about me. It was about assumptions we all make every day about people we don't know. Donovan Ricketts nodded slowly. The farmer who looked broke might be worth millions. The quiet kid in the corner might have the solution to your biggest problem. The elderly person everyone ignores might have wisdom that could change your life. Exactly, Coltrane confirmed. And the opposite is equally true. The person with the most expensive clothes might have nothing meaningful to offer. The loudest voice in the room might have the least valuable opinion. He walked around to check the trailer hitch one final time, then paused before getting into his truck, a well-maintained but modest Ford F-250 that had clearly seen years of honest work. I've got to get home, he said. This fellow needs to meet his new pasture mates, and I've got evening chores waiting. As he drove away, the group remained standing in the parking lot, watching the taillights disappear into the gathering dusk. They were all wealthy, successful people who had thought they understood how the world worked. Tonight, they were learning that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. 6 months later, Coltrane Weatherby stood in the same pasture where his grandfather had once broken horses, watching Midnight's Thunder graze alongside 3 mares that carried the bloodlines of the farm's original stock. The stallion had adapted to farm life with remarkable ease, as if he'd always belonged in these rolling Kentucky hills. The morning air carried the scent of new hay and the distant sound of combines working the wheat fields. Coltrane had returned to his daily routine of rising before dawn, checking his crops, and working alongside the men and women who helped maintain Weatherby Agricultural Holdings' flagship property. A familiar truck turned into the driveway, followed by several others. Coltrane smiled as he recognized his visitors, nearly every person who had been at the auction 6 months ago, plus several new faces. Donovan Ricketts emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by Helena Fairfax, Marcus Ashworth, and even Cordelia Vanderberg. Behind them came Dr. Vivian Cross, Jasper Beaumont, and to Coltrane's surprise, Braden Kowalski, the security guard who had ejected him from the auction. Mr. Weatherby, Donovan called out, approaching with obvious excitement. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but we wanted to see how Midnight's Thunder was settling in. Coltrane gestured toward the pasture where the stallion stood alert and magnificent, his black coat gleaming in the morning sun. See for yourself, he's home. The group gathered at the fence, watching as the horse approached with curious interest. When Coltrane extended his hand, Midnight's Thunder nuzzled it gently, then allowed several of the visitors to pet his neck. It's remarkable, Dr. Cross observed. His entire demeanor has changed. At the auction, he was beautiful but anxious. Now he looks content. He's got work to do, Coltrane explained. 3 of my mares are carrying his foals. By next spring, we'll have the beginning of a new bloodline that carries forward what my great-great-grandfather started. Helena Fairfax had been unusually quiet, but now she stepped forward with an envelope in her hands. Mr. Weatherby, I have something for you. After the auction, I felt terrible about how we all behaved, so I did some research into your family's history. She handed him the envelope. With trembling fingers, I found your great-great-grandfather's breeding records from before the Depression. They were in an estate sale in Louisville. I thought you should have them. Coltrane opened the envelope carefully, revealing pages of handwritten notes in faded ink. His eyes widened as he recognized breeding charts, lineage records, and detailed observations about horses that had been lost to his family for nearly a century. My God, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. These were lost when the bank foreclosed. We never thought, Helena, how did you find these? She wiped at her eyes. It took 6 months of searching, but I couldn't stop thinking about what you said at the auction, about completing the circle. I wanted to help. Jasper Beaumont stepped forward to examine the documents. Coltrane, these records show breeding decisions that were 50 years ahead of their time. Your great-great-grandfather was a visionary. And now, added Marcus Ashworth, you're continuing his work with modern resources and the same innovative spirit. Braden Kowalski, who had been standing quietly at the back of the group, finally spoke up. Mr. Weatherby, I wanted to apologize again for what happened at the auction, but I also wanted to tell you something. What you said about character. It changed how I do my job. I don't make assumptions anymore. Coltrane looked around, at the faces surrounding him, people who had started as strangers, become inadvertent adversaries, and had now transformed into something approaching friends. You know, he said thoughtfully, my grandfather always believed that everything happens for a reason. Maybe I needed to be thrown out of that auction to meet all of you. Maybe you needed to see past appearances to remember what really matters. Cordelia, Vanderberg, who had been quietly observing the reunion, stepped forward with her own contribution. Mr. Weatherby, I've established a scholarship fund for agricultural students from low-income families. It's called the Ezekiel Weatherby Memorial Scholarship. I wanted to honor your grandfather's memory and support young people who might otherwise be overlooked. The gesture was so unexpected and generous that Coltrane found himself speechless. For a moment, when he finally found his voice, it was steady but warm. I think my grandfather would have liked that very much. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the pasture where midnight's thunder grazed peacefully, Coltrane. Weatherby realized that sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones you plan for. Sometimes they're the ones that happen when you stay true to who you are, regardless of how others see you. The circle wasn't just complete. It was growing, encompassing people and possibilities that none of them could have imagined 6 months ago. And in the distance, the sound of combines working the fields reminded them all that the most meaningful success is built one honest day of work at a time.